Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and welcome to another episode of ISTJ Info Dumping. This particular episode, we're going to be doing something a little bit different, I know. Stretching my inferior intuition. Go me. We're going to be looking at something called the Berrens interaction styles, which are additional metrics besides the cognitive functions, which are used to make it easier to narrow down someone's actual personality. Now, whether or not I think that this is a prerequisite for discovering someone's type, I'm still working that out a little bit. But I will say that it seems to be relatively accurate for all 16 types except for the INFJ, and to a certain extent the ISFJ. So I thought rather than spend a lot of time telling you guys what each of the metrics are, I would start with the type that I'm conflicted on and use that as a basis for being able to explain things. So hope you guys like that unorthodox approach. If not, let me know in the comments and I'll go ahead and make an instructional video. But for now, my credentials for how do I know all this stuff, I watched a playlist on Mongolian Mindset YouTube channel called How to Find Anyone's Personality Type, which cites Linda Berrens and David Kiersey and Dario Nardi, and it goes over all of these interaction styles. And then I've also read a book called Understanding Yourself and Others by Linda Berrens, which gives a bit more of a concise answer as to what all of these are. Before we get into the metrics that INFJs have, let's first talk about their cognitive functions, because I find that the functions tend to work together with the interaction styles to make it even easier to tell a person's type. So INFJs lead with introverted intuition. They love the future. They love looking deeper into things. They tend to have these gut feelings they don't know how to explain, but yet somehow they end up being right sometimes, but more often than most of the sensing types. Extroverted feeling means they care about harmony and wanting to make sure that everyone's feelings are in a positive state. They tend to think more about the group's feelings than they do about their own. Then they have introverted thinking, which means that they can sometimes have a hard time describing their own reasoning, and it can be relatively weak reasoning because they're so busy thinking about people's feelings that objective logic they kind of struggle with a little bit. Then they have extroverted sensing as their inferior function, which means that they are going to pay more attention to what's going on in the moment than they are in the past. But because it's in the inferior, that means that they don't often like being in the moment because they want so hard to get to their goals. But when they are in the moment, they can tend to go a little bit overboard and come across as their ESTP shadow self. And then for the shadow functions, really quickly, we have extroverted intuition. INFJs occasionally like new ideas, but they're not really going to constantly seek them out. Introverted feeling, that's in the critic, so INFJs are not going to trust their own feelings or their own identity, instead saying that might be a burden on other people and they can't help others as much. Extroverted thinking, INFJs are awful at time management. They really have to teach themselves how to be effective because they're generally not very good at getting things done. They're also not particularly great at voicing their thoughts aloud as they come to their heads. A lot of times you'll hear INFJs using a lot of ums and what was I sayings when they do try to process out loud. And they also have a hard time telling people what to do. And then finally we have introverted sensing, which means that INFJs don't really like routines to be the end goal of their life. They might use a routine as a means to an end if it helps them get to their goal, but they're not going to use it like I do, where I need my routines or else I'm going to be very uncomfortable. And they also just generally don't have a very good memory of the past. And if they do remember stuff, they're going to remember the general vibe of everything as opposed to the tiny little details like I would do. Now that we've gotten the function stack out of the way, let's get into the metrics. So the first one is responding versus initiating. And all of the introverted types are responding, so that automatically makes the INFJ also a responder. So the way you tell between responding and initiating is how does the person begin or continue a conversation. Responders generally will, as the name implies, respond to the other person talking. Now, you might be thinking, "No, wait a minute, Paul. What if you're around only responders in a conversation? Obviously, someone's going to have to initiate, or the conversation's not going to get anywhere." A true responder will usually stay on topic and won't try to constantly interrupt the other person. Whereas an initiator might initiate a topic and then will bring up another topic and might like have an idea mid-conversation and interrupt so that they can get their idea in. So an INFJ might occasionally initiate conversations if it means that people's feelings, with their extroverted feeling, are going to be validated, but that's typically their only end goal. They don't typically think a whole lot about themselves when they're talking to people. You'd be surprised how hard it can be for me to ask INFJs, what do you personally feel or personally think about this, which I have to say to you? They tend to struggle a bit with that. And I think it's partially because their extroverted thinking is in their blind spot, so they just really don't think about thinking out loud a whole lot. But it also means that they're responders, so they're typically not going to start something new very much. They're going to be a bit more on the reserved side. They're going to want more smaller groups. Usually no more than 2 is the ideal for most INFJs. And if they have to push themselves into bigger groups, they're going to feel very exhausted afterwards and probably have to take either a very long nap or do something quiet in order to regain all of that lost energy. Next, we have abstract versus concrete, another easy one to narrow down because all of the intuitive types are abstract and all of the sensing types are concrete. So this is, where do you focus your understanding of the world? In the case of the sensors, they focus on what is tangible, what is able to be recognized with the 5 senses. So touch, taste, smell, sight, hearing, the kind of stuff that can pick up on is what the sensors will focus on. The abstract people, or the intuitives, are going to focus on stuff that either hasn't happened or is all hypothetical. So in other words, intangible stuff. So they're going to think about what will come ahead, not as much on the what could be, as that's more of the extroverted intuitives. But INFJs usually have a pretty clear idea of what the future is going to be, but because the future hasn't happened yet, you can't sense it with any of your 5 senses, so by definition, it's an abstract thing. INFJs tend to talk in metaphors a lot. I call it talking in riddles because I can't understand a word they're saying most of the time. Because they, not only are they abstract, but they also have introverted thinking. So that means that they're going to use their own internal reasoning, or as Myers-Briggs worded it, an internal logical construct, something like that. I just drew a blank on the exact terminology, but basically, rather than trusting in a lot of external facts or thinking about like charts and statistics and more objective stuff, INFJs are going to want to reason things out for themselves. So abstraction plus internal reasoning equals a very confused Paul, because I am ridiculously concrete, and I also don't typically like to use my own reasoning. I like to think what is and what is objectively true. Not what I think is true, not what you think is true, but what is true, how to prove it. And INFJs don't typically like to do that. So they're going to like a lot of theories and metaphors and hypotheticals. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. It just means that a lot of times I can feel like they're speaking a different language, even if they're technically speaking English. But I will say that not all of the abstract types are that confusing. I tend to find it easier to understand, for example, INTJs, because they at least have extroverted thinking and introverted feeling in the same slots that I do. So I can be like, okay, they're using the same judging functions that I am, but INFJs don't share any of my functions in common. So therefore, most of the time it just sounds like either gibberish or they're using way too many words or a bunch of factors. Next we have affiliative versus pragmatic. This is, how do you want to achieve results, and are you more of a cooperation or more of a loner type of mindset? I've also heard it described as utilitarian versus totalitarian. So by definition, all of the NF types are affiliative. An even better way of looking at it is David Kiersey has 4 personality types which were the 4 temperaments: guardians, idealists, rationals, and artisans. And all of the idealists and the guardians are all affiliative, and all of the rationals and artisans are pragmatic. So all of the idealists are the NFs, so that makes INFJs automatically affiliative. So what affiliativeness means, and I get it, it can be confusing because it sounds a lot like extroverted feeling. Affiliative means that you're going to think about what benefits the group the most, not necessarily what makes the group feel better. That's extroverted feeling, but what benefits the group. So to give you an example of how you can be affiliative but not extroverted feeling, ESTJs are affiliative. In fact, ESTJs and ISTJs are the only thinking types that are affiliative, which means that of all the thinking types, they're going to be the only 2 that really focus on the rules, because the rules are a set of instructions to ensure that the group is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So there's usually more of a sense of morality with being affiliative, because doing what is right is going to benefit the group. ESTJs like to be in charge, but unlike the ENTJs, where they might be a bit ruthless because they're so intent on getting to the end goal, the ESTJ is going to think about the individual members of the group they're in charge of and want to make sure that they are doing okay so that they can be more efficient. They're not going to care about people's feelings. They're going to care about, am I getting results? Is this going to impact the group? So INFJs, having both affiliativeness and extroverted feeling, are going to really focus on the group, but they're going to also focus on people's feelings. So they're going to come across as very affiliative, because a lot of times people get the 2 confused. INFJs are going to want to make sure that whatever the group wants is going to be what they end up doing. So an INFJ might sacrifice his or her personal desires if that makes the group happier. And their extroverted feeling is also going to want to make sure that they are taking into account other people's feelings. Affiliatives also, the way Mongolian Mindset's channel worded it is, they don't mess around when it comes to stuff like crime or breaking the rules, because affiliative people are not afraid of saying, you broke the rules, you're going to prison. So affiliative people, it's not like they will never, ever, ever break the rules, but they will typically feel very guilty about it. Whereas a pragmatic person will break the rules and then feel like, I can always apologize later if I get in trouble. Affiliative people have that innate sense of, this is the wrong thing to do, so I better not do it. So I think this fits INFJs really well. It fits me really well too. ISTJs have extroverted feeling in the 7th position, which means they don't tend to pay much attention to people's feelings. But I feel like we come across as considerably more considerate than the INTJs do, because they are pragmatic and have extroverted feeling in the trickster. So not only do INTJs have no idea what people are feeling, they also don't care about what is going to benefit the group. So constructs, rules, social customs, none of that matters to them. That's why they're usually hopeless at romance. ISTJs, we may be clueless about people's feelings, but boy do we have a good understanding of what's going to benefit the group. So if common courtesy benefits the group, then ISTJs are going to be the most polite types in the world, if they have to be. If what benefits the group is therapy, ISTJs will be like, all right, I'll be the therapist, not a problem. But they're not doing it to make people feel better. They're doing it to make the group better. So that's the way that you can tell the difference is, does it benefit the group? That's affiliative. Is it all about making sure people's feelings, their emotions are in harmony? That's extroverted feeling. Now we have, how do you give instructions? Are you direct or are you informative? And this is the area where I really feel like this is a hard one for me to believe for INFJs. INFJs, according to Linda Berrens, are classified as direct. So that means that INFJs are specific. They're going to use explicit instructions for when they're explaining something. They also will typically be, supposedly, more okay with directing the conversation more okay with telling people what to do and choosing their role. So for example, the example that I heard C.S. Joseph give is if a direct person sees that there's no milk in the fridge, he or she will say to his or her partner, "There's no milk in the fridge, go get some." An informative person, on the other hand, will look in the fridge and say there's no milk and end it at that. So the difference is that direct people are going to be so specific that there's next to no chance that you'll misunderstand what that person is saying, because they're so direct. They're going to use much more precise language. They're going to make sure that what it is that they're saying is said in as few words as possible and as understandable as possible. They're also going to be more willing to direct people in what to do. So usually you'll see, like, especially like the ESTJs, they're like hardcore direct. They're going to be like, you do this or else. INFJs though, I don't know. I feel like INFJs fit more into the informative category, which is weird because ISFJs are considered informative. Informative, to give you a little bit of an idea of why I'm so conflicted, informative means that you're going to give additional information for the sake of letting people find out for themselves. Informative people might use less wording or more wording than what's necessary, whereas direct people will use whatever amount of words is the most efficient to make sure that their point is absolutely understood. An informative person might be extra wordy or get on tangents, or they might give very vague, open for interpretation type of statements so that the other person doesn't feel like they're being bossed around but can come to their own conclusions. And in my personal experience, INFJs fit into the informative category. Typically speaking, it is very hard for me to get a straight answer out of them. Like, I usually have to literally say, please give me a straight answer. My intuition is down here. I have no clue what you're trying to say unless if you're more specific. And generally speaking, ISTJs are going to be pretty high up on the direct scale. I think the type that is the most direct might be the ISTP, because, like, have you ever heard of a vague ISTP? They typically tell it exactly like it is. But ISTJs are pretty up there because, being guardian types, they're going to care about like rules and regulations, and by definition that's going to involve being extremely precise with your language. And typically ISTJs and ESTJs are more okay with telling people this is how it's got to be, go do it. The thing that also makes me conflicted is that people that follow Linda Berrens tend to believe that if you don't fit the interaction styles, even if only one interaction style is off, then you're therefore not that type. So I've had friends that I'm like, I'm pretty certain these people are INFJs, and they'll be like, well, if they're informative, they're not. You probably got one of the metrics or the function stack wrong, so go and reevaluate it. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think it's possible that all 8 of the functions match up for the INFJ, but instead of being specific, concise, and to the point, instead they give either extra information or are not wordy enough, where you're left to your own interpretations, they don't get straight to the point, they kind of talk around the subject? Do you think that's more like them? Or, as Linda Berrens said, they're specific? They give explicit instructions, more willing to tell people what to do, have a one up, one down, I'm in charge of you type of mindset. Does that sound like INFJs to you? It doesn't to me, but maybe I'm just ignorant according to those people online. So moving on, next we have interest versus systematic. So INFJs are interest. In fact, all of the NF types are interest. As a matter of fact, the only feeling types that aren't interest-based are the ISFJs and ESFJs. So that means that interest is going to be compared to systematic or structured. And that's going to mean, how are you going to arrange how you plan out your day? Are you going to base it off of a system for getting things done? Or are you going to base it on the motives and the interests of the people around you? Now, this is yet another area where it could be confused with extroverted feeling, because we've already established INFJs, they care about other people's feelings. and they're affiliative, which means they care about the group. Add interest on top of that, and INFJs are some of the most considerate people out there, according to this system. Because with interest, INFJs are going to adjust their behaviors and how they go about their day based on what it is that everyone else is interested in. So to give you a bit of an example, which surprisingly I haven't been doing a lot of, I'm kind of surprised. If I'm hanging out with one of my INFJ friends and a new game just came out that I'm really excited about, the INFJ is willing to completely abandon the agenda and just say, Paul, you're interested in this game, let's talk about it. My ENFP friends do the same thing. They're also interest. We will have a hangout planned, but if I say hey, I made a new video, they'll say, let's watch your new video because that's what you're interested in. Now you can use an interest mindset on yourself, but typically I don't see INFJs doing that a whole lot. Because their introverted feeling is in the critic, they don't tend to trust their own feelings and their own emotions. So typically they're going to focus on what other people are interested in. So creating a more systematic, do this every single time type of approach is something that they will probably only do when they're alone. Whereas I think when INFJs are around other people, they're going to take on more of a whatever it is that you want, I want type of approach. Next we have progression or outcome. Now, admittedly, in the book that I read by Linda Berrens, she did not specifically use the words progression or outcome. She listed 4 different possibilities of how a person goes about approaching life. Charts the course, in charge, behind the scenes, or get things going, otherwise known as a starter type. I am not going to go into all 4 of those today. Instead, I am just going to go over what does chart the course mean and how does that relate to progression versus outcome. So ISTJs like myself are also chart the course, which means that we are typically the people that think about things in the steps required to get to the outcome, as opposed to the outcome people, which are going to go straight for the end goal and not necessarily think about the process. So usually the best way that you can tell if someone's progression or outcome is look at, do they go through the steps when they're talking, or do they go straight to the end product and not even bother with the journey? So for me, for example, I don't tend to think about my future a whole lot. If I do, it's something that's in the immediate future. But even then, I think about the logistics, which by definition is typically a process. I think about where I need to be, what I need to do, what is this, at what time, at what place. There's a lot of timing involved. And usually I plan for things that are nearby, whereas an outcome person typically has something, some kind of end goal that they're reaching toward. Now you might be saying, no, wait a minute, Paul, how can INFJs be progression? They're, of course, the most futuristic of all the types because they have introverted intuition. So of course they're going to be outcome, right? Well, the way I've heard it described is INFJs are going to think about the process required to get to the end goal. Sure, they might forget about sensory details on the way there because their extroverted sensing is low, but in terms of the necessary details to get to the end goal, that is what the INFJs are going to focus on. So even if it's not something they're tangibly noticing in the moment, they're still going to be thinking about it. So let's say the INFJ's end goal is to get married. That's typically an end goal of most of the hardcore intuitive types to begin with, because that's very future focused. The INFJ might be thinking about wedding plans. They might be thinking about how the date is going to go along. They might be thinking about what should they wear, what should they change about themselves, what would be the ideal partner. You notice how everything that I'm saying right here hasn't actually happened because they're abstract. So they're going to be thinking about the future and the possibilities and the what ifs. And as a result, when the moment actually comes where the INFJ has to take action, that's when they might freeze and be like, oh shoot, I did not prepare for this, because their extroverted sensing is so low that the in the moment stuff kind of takes them off guard. But typically, if they've planned ahead enough, they will be a bit more flexible than, say, the ENFJs would, where they are outcome. They are going to think about the end product first. So INFJs might say, well, okay, well, in order for me to plan a wedding, I need to think about everything that is involved in a wedding. So they might think about, like, do this, and then that, and then that, and then that. Of course, being intuitives, INFJs might not necessarily think about things in a sequential order the way that I do. I think about everything in exact steps. It has to be in a sequential order, and that goes through my train of thought, too. I don't typically jump around from one thought to another. I have to finish my train of thought, then move on to something else. And INFJs have a tendency to kind of like drop the subject and move ahead to the end. And I'm like, whoa, 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 you just confused me. You didn't finish your train of thought over there, so why are you jumping ahead to this? And I know that sounds abstract, but trust me, if you've been around INFJs enough, you start to realize that sequence is not really a thing that they think about, because if they were sequence oriented, they wouldn't think so far ahead, because they'd have to think about the now and the immediate future, but they don't. They think about everything out of order and then try to somehow make sense of all of it with their introverted intuition wanting to think, what is the big picture? So in that sense, I could see INFJs being progression in the sense that they do think about the steps, they just don't always think about them in the correct order. And in terms of sensory details, they might like neglect some of those along the way, but they are at least going to think about the hypotheticals and the what ifs and the abstractions. So with that, I think you can see now why I'm a bit confused by this new system, that even though I know the words and I know the definitions, I don't know, my personal experience tells me otherwise. But what do you think? Do you think it's possible that these people that I'm talking to aren't INFJs? Do you think they have a different function stack? Or do you think it's possible that they're just anomalies, or they're just people, and people have nuances, and these personality tests do not take into account nuances? They just think, you're this type, you're always going to act this way. Could there be an INFJ that's efficient, for example? Who knows? I know my one INFJ friend constantly talks about being efficient. Whether she actually is or not, that's another story, but the fact remains that she desires it. So could she be an anomaly, or does that make her an INFP? Because they say the fourth function is the aspirational one, so if she wants to be efficient but isn't, you guys tell me. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, my friends. I hope you have a wonderful day, and until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!